Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to the 60th episode of the podcast. I cannot believe that I'm saying that. It seems like just yesterday that we were talking about the first Nancy Drew book, The Secret of the Old Clock, and now we're almost done with the original 56 revised texts, and soon we're going to jump into the original texts, and it's so cool. So today, the book we're going to be talking about is The Strange Message in the Parchment. This is book 54, and it first came out in 1974. And I do have a little bit of a trigger warning for this episode. So the bulk of this mystery takes place on a sheep slaughtering farm, and while the book does go into a little bit of detail on that, I'm going to try not to go into too much detail on that, but if that bothers you, you might want to skip this episode. Now, first up, we're going to go ahead and discuss the different book covers for The Strange Message in the Parchment. There were 3 that I was able to find, and I also have posted these on my Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast. So if you want to check those out to kind of get a feel for the imagery we're about to talk about, you can head on over there. So first up, we have the cover edition that I grew up with, and this is again one of those vignettes that Rudy Nappy did. It shows Nancy in the middle of the scene, and the book cover itself is very brown. It kind of evokes a feeling of parchment when you look at it, and then everything else around Nancy is kind of sketch-like in quality. We have a picture of a woman. There's a woman actually sketching below Nancy's head, and then a man with his back turned, some angels up in the air, and what looks like a baby, and a ship running into a smaller ship. I have to admit, I did kind of laugh when I was looking closer at the cover for this book, because this big steamship is just plowing into this little dinghy, or maybe it's a sailboat. It does have sails on it, but it's just like, that's so true of a Nancy Drew book. We got a boat accident on the very front cover. Now, the second edition of this book cover is very much like the first, but I believe it's a UK edition, and they of course gave Nancy more dark red hair here. It's a little bit longer, and pretty much everything else looks exactly the same to me on this book, except for the font that The Strange Message in the Parchment is written in. Now, the third edition of this book cover, I don't know if this is a UK version or some other version, but it shows Nancy in a pink bathrobe, and she's running at this guy who's got a flashlight trained on her, and he's of course got the parchment, and he's getting ready to steal it. This is actually a scene from the book, but it is funny that Nancy is wearing her bathrobe, and she kind of honestly looks like Farrah Fawcett to me. I don't know. Does anyone else see it? Now, I did come up with a funny cover spoof for the first book cover in this set of 3, because I live for making these funny cover spoofs. They're just fun to me. So I said, The Case of Narcoleptic Nancy, because Nancy's eyes are closed, or it looks like she's at least looking down at the parchment. Maybe she's studying it, but it just looks like she's fast asleep. So as far as giving this book cover a cover rating, I gave it 4 magnifying glasses, and I'm talking mostly about the first cover. I just really like this cover. I like Nancy's hair. She looks really pretty on this cover, and how I've always imagined her to look. And this is one of the exceptions. I don't usually like the floating head technique that Rudy Nappy uses on some of the book covers, but this one is an exception. So now let's go ahead and talk about some of the characters that we see in The Strange Message in the Parchment. So first up, we have Junie Flockhart, who is a classmate of Nancy's, and we also see her parents in this book, and they are the ones that own this sheep slaughtering farmhouse. It's called Triple Creek. Also, I just love how they name some of these characters in the book so we'll remember them, like Flockhart. It makes me think of a flock of sheep, kind of like Rod Havelock in Mystery of the Brass-Bound Trunk. He was one of the pursers on the ship, so he literally locked people's things up. So just kind of funny. There's also a guy named Dan White, who is Junie's boyfriend. He comes in and out of the book at certain scenes. Vincenzo Caspari, who is an artist. Finney, who's a farmhand. Mr. Sal Rocco, who is Junie's neighbor. Ezekiel Shaw, who's a shepherd, and they just nicknamed him Easy. Miss Potter, who is the owner of this general store in town. Diana Bellardo, another artist, and Sid Zykes, who is a thief. And there's also a little boy named Tony that comes into the story pretty heavily. So really quickly, to set us up for this episode, I'll read a quick synopsis of the strange message in the parchment. Junie Flockhart, an old classmate of Nancy's, has a mystery for her to solve on her family sheep farm, Triple Creek. Her father bought a mysterious parchment with drawings on it and received a phone call from someone saying there was a message in the parchment that could right a wrong. Before Nancy can talk much about the mystery, though, a thief tries to steal her sheepskin jacket. Nancy finds herself at the Flockhart's farm trying to solve the mystery of the parchment when it is stolen. Hidden family secrets plague this case until Nancy can solve it. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with for this book is Long Lost Artist and Son Reunited. So now let's jump into some of the direct quotes and notes that I took down for this book. So in the first few pages of this book, Junie gives Nancy a sheepskin jacket, and while she and Hannah are helping Nancy pack for their trip to Triple Creek Farm, a thief comes into the house, steals the jacket, and Nancy and Togo give chase. It's so crazy to me, first of all, that this thief saw Nancy's jacket and followed her all the way back to her house, but Togo actually takes a hunk out of the thief's skirt before she can jump into a car, and Nancy finds her jacket on the ground a few feet away, and she gets the fleeing car's license number, which she then takes with the skirt fabric to Chief McGinnis. So already this trip and this mystery are getting off to a roaring good start. So the next note that I have down is apparently Togo opened the door for the thief, and Carson says they'll have to add another lock that he can't reach. This is not the first time that Togo's done that. Like, I think he opened the back door one time in another mystery, but I'm just like, this dog, like, you guys need to dog-proof your house. Too smart for his own good. Now, this next note has a little bit to do with Carson's work ethic. So apparently we get this context clue in the book. Carson graduated with honors from every school he went to. Pretty cool. That makes one of us. So this parchment that the mystery centers around with the strange message in it has a picture of a woman, a man with his back turned, angels in clouds holding a baby, and two boats colliding, like we talked about when we discussed the cover. So Nancy starts to suspect that these pictures tell a story, and they do, which we'll get to that a little bit later in the episode. So next, Nancy and Junie almost get run over by a car being driven by her neighbor, Mr. Rocco, and I just said, he's a peach. This guy's a jerk. He shows that throughout this book. He's not a nice man. What do you want to bet? He's the villain, because usually it's not always the case, but it seems like a lot of the time in these Nancy Drew books, the person that's mean to Nancy within the first 3 or 4 chapters is obviously the villain. I mean, if only it was that easy to tell who the bad guys are in real life, but that's not always the case. Like, sometimes people are just legitimately having a bad day. So anyways, Junie shows Nancy how the sheep are sheared at the farm, and at first this reminded me of Haunting of Castle Malloy, the computer game, because, you know, you have this fun little mini game where you get to shave all the sheep, but then it goes on to talk in detail about the sheep being slaughtered. Yikes. Like, I know that's how they make their livelihood, but I don't want to hear about that. I don't want to hear about these sweet little sheep being led off to slaughter. It's sad. I'm not going to go into detail with that, but this next thing, this is a rhyme that Junie recites in the book, and it's equal parts funny, but also just really, really bad. But she says, Junie had a little lamb, she kept it in a stall, but Daddy took the lamb away, now it's parchment on a wall. I was like, oh my gosh. These nursery rhymes just took a dark turn. Actually, most nursery rhymes are kind of dark if you think about it. Down will come baby, cradle and all. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Humpty Dumpty in that wall. Like, just, what is with that? So then Nancy just kind of compliments Junie, saying she's a poet. And then I think Nancy, like, not to be outdone, she's like, I got to show off my skills with poetry. And so she says, Junie had a little lamb. It really got her goat when Daddy took the pet away and made her friend a sheepskin coat. Ugh, like, Nancy, please, like, just stick to solving mysteries. Don't go there. So the next thing that I took note of is some men disturb the sheep in the pasture, and Nancy and Junie run after them. And Nancy is literally jumping sheep. She's like, it's like she's what are those things called? Is it called hurdling when you jump over those hurdles on the track? I don't know, but that's what I was picturing Nancy doing, but in a field with sheep. And so they, along with the sheepdog Rover, find Ezekiel Shaw. He's the shepherd, and he's unconscious. So as he comes to, he starts quoting scripture, and so he says, "I will seek that which was lost and bring again that which was driven away." And the funny thing about this book, anytime Ezekiel starts quoting scripture, it's at the bottom of the page and it's got a little asterisk next to it. So it's Ezekiel 34:16. So I was just like, oh, okay. He also kind of has a very biblical profession, being a shepherd and all. So when Nancy and Junie get back to the house, they take the parchment out of the frame and she finds the letters A, D, B, and the word Milano on the back. And Mr. Flockhart says he bought the parchment from, dun dun dun, Sal Rocco, the guy who tried to run them over with a car. Something tells me the fact that Milano is written on the back of this parchment, it doesn't have to do with cookies. And Nancy is like, well, Sal Rocco is Italian, and Milan, it's a city in Italy, then maybe this parchment came from Italy. That's a pretty fair deduction to make there. So next, Nancy and Junie decide to pay Mr. Rocco a visit, and they go to ring the bell, and he doesn't answer, so they very wisely decide, let's climb the gate and just go onto his estate without his permission. So of course this turns out to be a horrible idea, and they get attacked by a flock of vicious birds. And eventually Salvatore Rocco comes out, and he's really annoyed because they're questioning him about this parchment. And they also end up talking to a little boy named Tony, and Nancy has a hunch that he could be the baby on the parchment. I can't exactly remember what her reasoning for this was. Maybe she was like, oh, well, he looks like him, but I'm like, how many people look like, somebody else, and it's just, maybe she thinks that because of the age of the boy. She's like, well, this parchment's not that old, and this boy is only this old. It's kind of a jump. Like, to me, a person reading the book, it seems like a illogical conclusion to jump to, but it's Nancy Drew and she's always right. So the next note that I wrote down is, oh yeah, so the shepherd, Ezekiel Shaw's nickname is Easy, and I can't help but think of a rapper. So I was like, yo, I'm little Easy. I watch the flocks of sheepies, and when I go to sleep, I count them 1, 2, 3 Oh my gosh, I'm telling you, I miss my calling. The next note that I have down is Junie names one of the lambs Cheerio. And I don't know if this lamb is just exempt from being, taken and made into a coat at some point. Like, I don't know. Like, I would think that would be really sad to name these sheep if they're just gonna, go be slaughtered later. I don't know. But Cheerio is a cute name. So Ezekiel, the shepherd, or Easy, tells them he thinks Rocco overworks his Italian workers and is abusive to Tony. This part is really bad. I was just like, that's not, like, this guy, as if we don't have any other reasons to not like him. He tries to run people over with cars. He's got flocks of vicious birds on his property, and now he's overworking people. So the next thing that happens in the book is Nancy gets scooped up and almost thrown by a ram. This was so crazy. She, manages to hold on to its horns, but it keeps trying to pitch her into the air and just... I've seen rams charge people. I've seen Canadian geese charge people, and even that seems kind of scary to me. But thankfully and miraculously, Nancy somehow avoids, she gets by without getting harmed too bad. And then Mr. Flockhart, Junie's father, asks Nancy to design a new logo for the farm. Now, we knew that Nancy is an artist. She's shown that in different books, but now apparently she's a graphic design artist. So next up, Nancy, Junie, and Junie's boyfriend Dan go to talk to Tony, since Dan apparently has been taking some classes in Italian at college, and Mr. Rocco chases them off. He doesn't want anyone talking to Tony, which is very suspicious. The next note that I took down is Nancy gets up in the middle of the night and sees an intruder trying to steal the parchment. So they get away and they take the parchment with them. And this is actually the scene that we talked about on that third book cover. Nancy comes down in her bathrobe and tries to apprehend them, but they get away. But Nancy luckily does collect some evidence. She has their glove, which she pulled off of their hand, so she gives gives it to the police, and when he shows up to get prints from the doorknob and examine the glass from the frame that broke, Nancy kind of watches him. It's funny, she likes to watch the police like do their fingerprinting and stuff, I've noticed in a couple of the books. I mean, that would be pretty cool to watch. So it's at this point in the book when Nancy and Junie start following different leads, and they go to hardware shops asking if a man has been in to buy glass to replace in a frame. They have the rough measurements of what that glass was over the parchment, so it broke and they know he's going to be replacing it. And then they also go by drugstores to see if he has bought bandages for his cut hand. This was honestly some cool detective work. I like that they went to these different places. That was very smart. But there's a woman at the drugstore and she gives the man's name, Sid Zykes. What a name. These villains have the weirdest names. So Nancy asks if he wore gloves, and the lady says, "It wouldn't surprise me. Sid, in his own flashy way, can be quite a dude." This reminded me of the secretary in Ferris Bueller when she's like, "Oh, he's a righteous dude." I mean, Nancy was asking because he's a thief, not because she's interested in the fashion statement that he's making. I love how whenever Nancy interrogates people about a villain, they always assume that she's interested in him, or that she likes his fashion sense or something about him. It's just so weird. I'm like, no, she's trying to solve a mystery and this person broke the law. So Nancy talks to her dad, Carson, and he says that he and Hannah miss her, and he also says the girl who stole Nancy's jacket was caught. So apparently Chief McGinnis has been hard at work back in River Heights, and she's a known petty thief and hitchhiker, and Nancy will have to testify against her in 2 weeks. A sleuth's work is never done. So next up, Nancy and Mr. Flockhart go to get Nancy some parchment so she can recreate the painted parchment because she wants to show it to people, and since it's stolen, she doesn't have it for reference. So Easy shows Nancy a glove that Rover brought him when they go to get parchment from him, and it's the thieves' matching glove. Then Easy just starts singing for no reason. I don't think this was the song that he was singing, but I'm just picturing him singing like Smooth Criminal by Michael Jackson because he's holding that one glove. But thankfully we don't have to listen to him sing for too long, and then Sid Zykes, the criminal who stole the parchment, is put in jail. So the next thing that I wrote down is Nancy and Junie get cans of paint thrown on them while Nancy is trying to recreate the parchment that was stolen, and these two men run off. So they have globs of paint on them and they have to go wash themselves off, and then of course the parchment that Nancy was trying to recreate was ruined. But Nancy and Junie later go to Mr. Rocco's on a hunch, and they find paint of the same brand that was thrown at them, and overhear two men talking about persuading people to do something. So Sal Rocco is looking more guilty by the minute. So these guys obviously are the ones that threw paint on Nancy and Junie, and then they end up going to talk to Miss Potter, who owns the general store, and they ask kind of casually if two men tried to convince her to join a group, and she says yes, it was a group looking to ask for higher wages and benefits for farm workers. And I just said, call me crazy, but that sounds like a good thing, like people should be paid a living wage and what they deserve. But then Miss Potter elaborates and says that they were trying to take money up front in a fraudulent manner. So yeah, I'm for the farmers getting paid what they deserve, but these guys are obviously trying to appeal to people's emotions and take money from them. So the next thing that ends up happening in the book is Nancy, Dan, and Junie go back to Rocco's to talk to the workers in Italian, and they find out that Tony has ran away. So they quickly locate him though, and they take him to stay with Easy where they think he'll be safe. And Nancy actually has Tony write a note to Rocco telling him he'll come back if Rocco says who his real parents are. So Nancy's starting to figure out Tony is not Rocco's son or his nephew or whatever he's claiming him to be. She knows that she thinks that he's been kidnapped. So Dan leaves the note that Tony writes in a tree, and the note they get back addresses Tony's kidnappers. So tell me that doesn't reek of abusive narcissism. Like, the person who kidnapped this kid is accusing these other people who are trying to help him of being his kidnappers. It's crazy. So a character that I mentioned earlier in the episode, Mr. Caspari, he's another artist, he tracks down Diana Bellardo in Italy and says that she's coming to America. So she's the woman who painted the original parchment, and they think that she's Tony's mother. The next note that I wrote down is Bess, George, Ned, Bert, and Dave finally show up. So they haven't been around for the majority of this mystery, but Bess and George go with Nancy and Junie to meet Easy and Tony, who is busy learning English. And George notices Easy going to check on the sheep and says he should be called Uneasy. George Fane, everybody. She's got jokes. So after this, two men come by accusing Nancy of being a kidnapper and saying they work for a welfare agency, and Rover, the sheepdog, attacks them and they kick him. This was so sad. I was like, no, don't kick Rover. But all the girls say the men are wearing fake badges and grab one, and the men get scared and take off. So next, the girls take the badge to the police, and Nancy and Junie talk to Sid Zykes. And Nancy is semi-nice to him, and he says, I think maybe I'll go straight from now on. Right. So next, Ned, Bert, and Dave do some sleuthing for the Flockharts, and they pretend to be farmers to see if they can get some of the other farmers to talk. And I was like, yeah, I'm sure 3 fraternity brothers stuck out like sore thumbs. I mean, these guys are used to selling insurance, not working on the farm. But hey, every little bit helps if we can solve this mystery. So it's at this point in the mystery when Miss Bellardo finally comes to America, and it does come out that she is Tony's mom. And apparently her husband died in a boating accident. That's what's depicted on the parchment from this mystery. And then his brother, who happens to be Sal Rocco, wanted to marry her, but she refused. So he stole her son Tony and ran off with him. So first of all, ew, you're not obligated to marry your brother-in-law. And then the fact that he stole her kid and took him to a whole nother country is really messed up. So Nancy and Miss Bellardo go to find Tony and find him and Easy tied up. And then they get tied up before Nancy's friends can save them. So eventually everybody comes and saves Nancy, Miss Bellardo, Tony, and Easy, and then Sal Rocco is arrested, and there's an angry mob outside wanting a piece of him. This guy has a lot of enemies, but the good news is Tony is reunited with his mom in the end. So that is all the notes that I have for the strange message in the parchment, and next up is a segment that I like to call What's Cooking. There really wasn't that much cooking in this book. Really, we only got mentionings of lemonade, ice cream, and crackers. But for the things that I said Nancy could add to her resume, I said she's a poet and she didn't know it. She started just making up these rhymes on the spot, and she's a graphic designer. She designed the logo for Triple Creek Farm. Now let's jump into the things that I liked and the things I didn't like for the strange message in the parchment. So the things I liked the sheep. I didn't like the fact that they were slaughtered, but I did like the sheep in this book. There were actually a lot more things that I didn't like about this book. I didn't like the depiction of Italian farm workers. I didn't like Tony being abused by his uncle. And I didn't like the scripture that was taken out of context in this book. Like, some of it made sense, and then some of it did not make sense. So when it came to giving this book a magnifying glass rating, I gave it 1 magnifying glass. It wasn't the most enjoyable book to read. I mean, the plot was fairly predictable. I liked the cover of this book way more than the actual contents of this book, if that makes sense. So yeah, that concludes today's episode for the strange message in the parchment. And for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the mystery of Crocodile Island, and I'm going to have another guest on the show. Alexa from River Heights Buzz podcast will be on that episode. So if you guys like books about crocodiles and smuggling rings and submarines, then you're really going to enjoy this book. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.